Welcome to this week's Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Venice video service. I want to again express deep appreciation to our video team, Dick Smith, who helped set everything up, Aaron Fangboner on camera, music director Marcy Leonard, and also Karen Griffin for taking all these little cybers and turning them into something worth watching. Alas, this will be the last video we shoot in the sanctuary for a little while because of the governor's shutdown order, but the videos will continue. They'll be shot in a different way, in a different venue. We'll find a way. Love will find a way. Again, you might consider lighting a candle as we light our chalice, which we'll do in a moment, so that we're more in oneness in the moment. You're invited, never ordered. And again, if you need to pause the minister to go get a candle, that's just fine. Use that pause button all you need to. I also want to recommend the Friday Happenings email. There's a ton of good news and information about dealing with this crisis we're in. It's also a place for joys and concerns. If you have something you proudly want to share or a concern that's on your mind, send that to Happenings as well, so that we can kind of be closer and keep track of one another. One concern I have, alas, is that there are a lot of scammers out there, and some of them pretend to be ministers and send emails to people. And if Reverend Van Zant or I or any other minister will never ask you to buy gift cards to send to anybody. If you get such an email, the best thing you can do, especially if it's from Gmail, is go to their feedback page, if you can find it, and send feedback that that is a scam address. And if they get enough of them, maybe it'll slow the scammers down a little bit. Also, while our physical church is shut down, and again, videos have their purpose, but interaction is limited, so you're invited to Sunday morning Zoom U-Coffee Hour, virtual coffee hour, joys and concerns sharing. That'll be at 11 Sunday morning. You're invited to check in 10 or 15 minutes early to get any Zoom difficulties squared away. And also this month, being a virtual service, we are unable to take a real live collection. And this month our social justice donation goes to All Faiths Food Bank Backpack Kids. Donations can be made by check to UCOV with Backpack Kids on the memo line and mailed to the church, or you can use the donate button on the UUCOV website. Your contributions are much needed and appreciated, and hopefully do show again that life does go on even in the midst of pandemics. So now let us prepare to reflect and celebrate. A colleague of mine, Gretchen Haley, writes, "There is enough space between us to hold all that you are carrying, all you've been waking, wondering, worrying, or wearing out with confusion or attempts to control, trying to find some sense of normal, all of your irritability, your curiosity, your fragile sobriety, your numb disbelief, your loneliness, your exhaustion, your daily question, allergies, or the virus, and your joy. All these things, we can hold them. We can hold the joy too. We can hold all of it here for this time and bless it. Here we will call each other just as we are, beloved. Here in this far apart space that is also so close in, so much remains uncertain. With each passing breath, the ground is shifting. All we can say for sure is that we are caught in this tangled blessing of life together, like always, except more. With all the forces of spring and the spinning of the earth, we are turning and becoming and beginning again, offering ourselves like the flower, breaking through with a wild beauty, ready for whatever comes next. Come, let us worship together. And I invite you to join in singing our opening hymn, number 187, It Sounds Along the Ages. Oh, a moment. Almost forgot to light the chalice. Now I invite you to join in singing our opening hymn, number 187, It Sounds Along the Ages. It sounds along the ages, soul answering to soul. It kindles on the pages of every Bible scroll. The psalmist heard and sang it, from martyred lips it broke, and prophet tongues outrang it, till sleeping nations woke. From Sinai's cliffs it echoed, it breathed from Buddha's tree. It charmed in Athens' market, it hallowed Galilee. The hammer stroke of Luther, the pilgrim seaside prayer, the oracles of concord, one holy word declare. It calls and lo, new justice, it speaks and lo, new truth. In ever nobler stature and unexhausted youth, forever on resounding and knowing not of time, our laws but catch the music of its eternal chime. And I invite you to join in our responsive reading this morning, Mysterious Time. As always, I'll read the one parts and invite you to respond in the bold-faced many parts. Mysterious time gives birth to all the wonders that we find around us.
When the universe was young and formless, clouds of gas gathered, compressed, solidified, and then the first stars blinked out.
They shone their long lives through into the cosmos until weighed down by endless eons' accumulation of heavy atoms, they sagged, collapsed, and died.
In their dying, they gave birth to new substances, new atoms, new molecules, which radiated out through the cosmos, a changing, evolving order of things.
More eons passed, generations of matter, one cataclysm after another. Some found their way to the same cosmic destination, formed our world, and then the living beings upon our world.
The living cells that make our bodies and the foodstuffs and the water that sustains our bodies all emerged out of time.
Before this tapestry of endless eons, then, we all weave our own threads of hope and love and justice.
Let us be of good cheer, therefore, because we do our work in a mighty setting.
Because it is certain, if we do our work steadfastly and with faith, all will be accomplished in the unfolding of time. Reverend Victoria Safford writes about Passover, actually, but I think it applies to our current situation as well. They had no idea where they were going when they left that night in the dark, without lights, without shoes, without bread, their children smothered against them so they would make no noise. They went into the wilderness. They wandered 40 years. So many of them died before getting anywhere, and many were born in the desert and grew to adulthood knowing nothing but the journey, not slavery, not freedom, just the journey. In the springtime, we remember the promised land is not a destination. It is a way of going. The land beyond the Jordan, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter, you carry it inside you all the while. It is planted in your mind and heart already before you ever start out, before it even occurs to you that in order to leave that life behind you in Egypt, wherever your particular Egypt happens to be, and the intolerable bondage of your personal Egypt, the first thing you need to do is stand up and walk forward. And our choral response is number 377. In greening lands begins the song, which deep in human hearts is strong. In cheerful strains your voices raise, to fill the whole spring world with praise. We have a reading this morning from a 150-year-old book titled Marie by a French tourist named Gustave de Beaumont. He writes, "The first time I attended a theater in the United States in October 1831, I was surprised at the careful distinction made between the white spectators and the audience whose faces were black. In the first balcony were whites, in the second, mulattoes, in the third, Negroes. An American beside whom I was sitting informed me that the dignity of white blood demanded these classifications. However, my eyes being drawn to the balcony where sat the mulattoes, I perceived a young woman of dazzling beauty, whose complexion of perfect whiteness proclaimed to me the purest European blood. Entering into all the prejudices of my neighbor, I asked him how a woman of English origin could be so lacking in shame as to seat herself among the Africans. That woman, he replied, is colored. What, colored? She's whiter than a lily. She is colored, he replied coldly. Local tradition has established her ancestry, and everyone knows that she had a mulatto among her forebears. And he pronounced these words without further explanation as one who states a fact which only needs to be voiced to be understood as a complete truth. In about the same moment, I made out in the balcony for whites a face which seemed to me very dark. I asked for an explanation of this new phenomenon. The American answered, "The lady who has attracted your attention is white." "What white? She's the same color as any of the mulattoes." "She is white," he replied. "Local tradition affirms that the blood which flows in her veins is Spanish." dare I say, wow. Frenchman Gustave de Beaumont, who wrote this morning's reading, was fascinated by the early United States. During the 1830s, he toured extensively with his more famous friend, Alexis de Tocqueville. They both wrote books about the U.S. De Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, became a smash hit here and is still must-reading for students of American history. De Beaumont's book, Maria, sank without a ripple. It's something only a history professor would dig up today. De Tocqueville wrote that American love of freedom and equality combined with our Anglo-Saxon racial energy made us prosperous, Western expanding, and destined for empire. He mentions the English race many times and our equality of social conditions. And you have to read far into his book to find more than a hint that anybody even lived in this country who wasn't white. One chapter does mention Native Americans and African slaves. He writes sadly that Native Americans will probably become extinct because of, quote, fearful evils that are impossible to imagine and also impossible to relate. He has a low opinion of Southern slave owners, and then adds that blacks, quote, only constitute an unhappy remnant, a poor little wandering tribe lost in the midst of an immense nation which owns all the land. De Tocqueville did make some astute observations about this country, but he also bought into stereotypes and largely turned his eyes away from our blatant racism. That little wandering tribe of blacks he mentioned made up 18% of the population. Slavery was practiced in every state, North and South. His chapter on race is one of the shortest in his book, and it's not even included in some editions. His editors prefer happier observations about our energy, bright future, freedom, and equality. Going back to de Beaumont, he found American race relations fascinating. He marveled at our so-called one-drop rule. A child born with the tiniest portion of African descent, one drop of African blood, as they put it, was still 100% black in the eyes of the law. He was aghast at our rationalization and lack of logic around race. De Tocqueville's book sold like hotcakes. Everyone who was anyone bought a copy, especially in New England. De Beaumont's writing on racism just got ignored. Of course, Americans did not invent racial baggage. European racial theory developed from the Roman historian Tacitus on. For the first 2,000 years, it was about European cultural variation: Germans, Franks, Celts, Semites, Slavs, Nordics, Hispanics, and so on. Then Europe's voyages of discovery in the 1400s and 1500s started finding exotic people in exotic lands, and that led them to connect race with skin color. Racial theory evolved into an ever thicker morass of ignorance, rationalization, and doublethink that really showed human nature at its worst. It's also a reservoir for a theological condition German linguist Victor Klemperer called in German Ahnungslosigkeit, which translates into English as cluelessness. Now, I hesitated to use that term because it's so culturally loaded in American society, but it is a central piece of the human condition. In the words of astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, quote, "One of the great challenges of this world is to know enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about a subject to realize you're wrong." Victor Klemperer, for the record, was a Jew living in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and he suffered terribly. Sympathetic Germans knew just enough about his situation to think they understood it, but not enough to grasp how truly horrible it was or to be any help. So apply that to our ignorance of any marginalized group, and that's what Ahnungslosigkeit, cluelessness, is. There are two components. First is not understanding someone else's depth of suffering, and the second is not understanding that we don't understand. And I have to confess, I've certainly been clueless on occasion in precisely that way, but I have lots of good company. One example is the most influential Unitarian minister and public intellectual of the entire 19th century, Boston's William Ellery Channing. Channing was a renowned writer and lecturer. He was considered an expert on pretty much everything. He was also friends with Alexis de Tocqueville, and he influenced the French writer. Channing was also sincerely concerned about the problem of slavery, so he wrote a book on that. In 1835, the problem was, as Neil deGrasse Tyson puts it, Channing knew just enough about slavery to think he could write a book about it, but not enough to realize how wrong his book was. And that's what Ahnungslosigkeit, cluelessness, is. While I was reading Channing's book on slavery, I also happened across a magazine article on what's now called African Burial Ground National Monument in Lower Manhattan, New York. It was a slave cemetery, and it was still in use during Channing's lifetime. 15,000 slaves were buried there. Archaeologists excavated many skeletons, and they showed evidence of overwork, malnutrition, and broken bones from beatings. The average age of death was 12 years. In other words, the average baby born into slavery in New York City, supposedly gentler than the southern plantations, died of overwork, malnutrition, abuse, and disease before even reaching their teens. Now, frankly, I have to say, that contrast made Channing's book on slavery a little gag-inducing to me. He opposed slavery not because of its brutality or because he considered Africans equal to Europeans. He didn't. He opposed slavery on philosophical grounds. Basically, he wrote, slavery drags down both slave and master. And at the same time, he bought into every comforting stereotype slaveholders used to justify the practice. On the cruelty of slavery, he wrote, quote, "There is an increasing disposition to multiply the comforts of slaves, and in this let us rejoice." And he later added, "The African is so affectionate, imitative, and docile that he catches much that is good, and accordingly the influence of a wise and kind master will be seen in the very countenance and bearing of his slaves." Close quote. Again, the average slave in that New York cemetery was dead from overwork, malnutrition, accidents, and beatings by age 12. So much for wise and kind masters. But here's the rub. Channing was a decent, intelligent man. He cared deeply about the welfare of every human being, but he also, just as deeply, wanted to be reasonable. To him, it was abolitionists who were being unreasonable. Being wealthy himself, he sympathized with the property rights of slaveholders. And as Neil deGrasse Tyson would put it, having talked only to slave owners, he knew enough to believe he had it right, but it never occurred to him to ask a slave what slavery was actually like. He had no clue how inaccurate his assessment was, and that's what Unschlossigkeit, cluelessness is. Philosopher and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson was becoming famous late in Channing's life. Trained as a Unitarian minister, Emerson led the American Transcendentalist movement, and his lectures and essays inspired the brash confidence of our westward expansion. Many of his religious writings are brilliant and spiritual, and many Unitarian Universalist ministers look to him for inspiration. In her fascinating book, The History of White People, historian Nell Irvin Painter also calls Emerson the philosopher king of American white race theory. Unlike Emerson's other work, his writings on race are forgotten today, but he enthusiastically accepted European racial theories. He refined them for American eyes, then added a strong racial component to our sense of ourselves as a brash, bold, expanding new nation. To go back, to go back from ancient Rome on, Europeans wrote about their different tribal cultures in racial terms. Different writers from different regions would list reasons why their group was the best race. And in fact, the very reason the word Caucasian came into use for white people was that in the 1700s, a German named J.F. Blumenbach wanted to include the Sanskrit writing Indo-European language group in the so-called white race. The Caucasus Mountains were centrally located northeast of dark-skinned African Negroes and northwest of brown-skinned East Asian Orientals, and that gave Blumenbach an excuse to call both Europeans and Northwestern Asian Sanskrit writers Caucasians. The name stuck, but it was all based on language and geography and not at all on biology and not really even on skin color. As Painter icily points out, racial theory has nothing to do with science or sound scholarship or even consistent logic. Brilliant though he was in other ways, Ralph Waldo Emerson was a perfect example. He considered England racially superior to all other nations, and he wrote that our English roots were the reason for American racial superiority. There were, he wrote, 3 races in the British Isles: Celtic, Nordic, and Anglo-Saxon. Now, Americans despised Irish immigrants back then, so Emerson wrote that Irish Celts were definitely inferior. Anglo-Saxons were best, but Angles and Saxons are German. And Emerson didn't much like Germans, so he wrote that yes, English Anglo-Saxons were superior, but only because they had been influenced by invading Viking, Nordic blood. The problem with that was in the 19th century, Nordic nations were economically poor and seen as backward. So Emerson got around that by saying, well, the best Nordics had all left and gone south to England. Contemporary Nordic nations were inferior, but their departed cousins had made the English superior. And that was the kind of nonsense that was all the rage among intellectuals in the 1800s. Emerson's writings on race were popular and very influential in his own time. Unitarian Universalists do like to quote a journal entry in which Emerson calls this country a racial melting pot to show that he believed in equality, but Painter finds that kind of generosity nowhere else in Emerson's writings. Like Channing, Emerson disliked slavery, but also on philosophical grounds. He, like Channing, considered Africans inferior. Typical of Emerson, Painter states, is a passage in which he writes, quote, "The lost captivity of 1,000 Negroes is nothing to me." And he goes on to say that everyone except his beloved Nordic-influenced Anglo-Saxons are, in his words, guano races. My dictionary, by the way, defines guano as, quote, quote, the excrement of seabirds. Now, I care about marginalized peoples, but you know, it was healthy for me to read this. Being of Irish descent myself, I have read how disliked Irish immigrants were in the 1800s, but that was intellectual understanding, not gut level. I grew up blonde and blue-eyed, and I've always felt white, and I needed that little gut punch. Rather than a blue-eyed professional who passes easily through airport screening stations, I am, in the eyes of Unitarian Universalist icon Ralph Waldo Emerson, just a piece of excrement that passes easily through the guts of seagulls. Eastern Europeans, Greeks, Italians may all be considered white and real Americans now. But in Emerson's day, they were also guano races. Sadly, one individual who loved Emerson's racial theories was a German-connected English crank named Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Basing some of his own racial theories on Emerson, Chamberlain later became what some historians call the John the Baptist of Nazi racial theory. An American white nationalist still quote him today. Now, I have to say, that is a Unitarian historical connection I wish I had never found. But you know what? We need to own all of our history. Our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, does not mean we think everyone is good and perfect. What it does mean is that we also need to own our own blunders and the skeletons in our own closets. Two of the greatest figures from our heritage, William Ellery Channing and Ralph Waldo Emerson, are two perfect examples of this kind of imperfection. As a reality check, a Scientific American magazine article titled, quote, "Does Race Exist?" explains that genetic analysis can be used to categorize people for medical or scientific purposes, but those groupings have nothing at all to do with what we call race. Different skin colors, hair texture, some aspects of body shape involve very few genes out of an entire human genome. It's possible for you to have more genes in common with someone of a different race than with someone of your own race who just happens to look like you. There's more genetic variation within each so-called race than between races. Scientifically, then, racial theory, from Tacitus to Ralph Waldo Emerson to Houston Stewart Chamberlain to now, is complete and utter nonsense. Race, as commonly conceived, is a cultural construct, no more. That doesn't mean it's not important. Race has tremendous impact in this country. No one is as colorblind as we like to say we are, but answers to racial questions and solutions to racial problems are not to be found in genetics or biology, but in sociology and psychology. Despite all this, supposedly well-educated people can still be stunningly ignorant about race. Free Inquiry magazine, for example, claims to celebrate reason and humanity and proudly proclaims its own open-mindedness and enlightenment. And yet, several years ago, I ran across an article by Princeton University bioethics professor Peter Singer, no less, commenting on the poverty of equatorial African nations and calling for testing to, quote, investigate the possibility of a link between race and intelligence. He also suggested that anyone who opposed such testing preferred, quote, ignorance over knowledge. Now, given all I've shared, it's stunning to me that an Ivy League ethics professor could practically claim sole ownership of reason while displaying total ignorance of the scientific realities of genetics and race. Just to start with, where would, for example, Barack Obama, whose father was African and whose mother was Euro-American, even be placed on Professor Singer's white or black test? How many stations between pure black and pure white do we need on his testable white-black scale? In other words, Singer waves this banner of reason while mired in the very same 150-year-old racial nonsense expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. As they say, the past is not dead. It's not really even past. The science of genetics makes plain it's scientifically ignorant to link the genetically inconsequential thing we call race with the extremely complex thing we call intelligence. And for the record, economist Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, and other socioeconomic studies go into a long list of reasons for poverty in equatorial nations, and none of those reasons involves the intelligence of the population. But that's Ahnungslosigkeit, cluelessness for you. Being well educated, Singer knew enough to consider himself an expert on a topic outside his field, but he didn't know enough to realize how ridiculously wrong and really quite silly his article was. Problem is, writings like his don't take place in a vacuum. They harm people who have to live with the stereotypes they reinforce. There's also a lesson for Unitarian Universalists in this. Many of us are also well-educated and economically privileged. That does not mean we understand as much about people on society's margins as we may think we do. LGBTQI folk, people of color, people with a range of disabilities, the list is long. And if we want to understand their situations and what help might look like from their viewpoints, we need to begin with humility and by listening to voices that too seldom receive a respectful hearing. One great challenge of the human condition, Neil deGrasse Tyson tells us, is that we know enough about a subject to believe we understand it, but not enough to realize we actually don't begin to understand it. But the good news is there is a cure. Part 1 is called humility, and part 2 is called listening to voices we often don't take seriously enough. And that's good exercise for any intellect, anytime. Amen. May it be so. And I'll invite you to close our service by singing hymn number 140, Hail the Glorious Golden City. Glorious golden city, pictured by the seers of old. Everlasting light shines o'er it, wondrous things of it are told. Wise and righteous men and women dwell within its gleaming wall. Wrong is banished from its borders, justice reigns supreme o'er all. We are builders of that city, all our joys and all our groans. help to rear its shining ramparts. All our lives are building stones, whether humble or exalted, all are called to task divine. All must aid alike to carry forward one sublime design. And the work that we have builded, oft with bleeding hands and tears, often error, often anguish, will not perish with our years. It will live and shine transfigured in the final reign of right. It will pass into the splendors of the city of the light. We are the children of the cosmos, living out the wonders of the universe, but living out its horrors as well. The very forces that create and destroy stars are alive in our bodies. Let us take nothing for granted, but at the same time, let our aspirations be unlimited. Let us be humble but creative. Let us be circumspect but also appreciative. And let us do all that it is possible for us to do, and let us be amazed by the end result of our striving. Shalom, salam, blessed be, and amen. And I'll extinguish the chalice. May the light follow us into the world, be with us, and join in singing our closing song, Spirit of Life. Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit